Most people begin with a completely flawed assumption when they lie to an empath. They believe they are dealing with someone soft, someone who prioritizes harmony over accuracy, someone who will accept a convenient explanation simply to avoid tension. And on the surface, that assumption can appear correct because empaths often do choose calm over conflict. They do give people space to explain themselves. They do respond with patience when others might react with suspicion. But this is where perception becomes dangerously misleading, because what looks like softness is often observation. What looks like acceptance is often evaluation. What looks like trust is often temporary suspension of judgment. The empath is not disengaged. They are paying attention in a way most people are not. They are not only hearing your words, they are tracking your consistency. They are noticing how your emotional tone aligns or fails to align with what you are saying. And this creates a critical difference because the average person listens for content. The empath listens for congruence. So when someone lies, they assume the empath is focused on what is being said, but the empath is focused on something else entirely. Does this feel real? Does this match everything else I've observed? Is there tension beneath this explanation? And that is where the misunderstanding begins to collapse, because deception depends on managing appearances. It depends on controlling the narrative at the surface level, but empaths are not operating only at the surface. They are reading beneath it. And when you lie to someone who naturally pays attention to what leaks through, not just what is presented, you are not simply hiding the truth. You are creating contrast. And contrast is what reveals you. Most people think lying is a verbal act. They think if the sentence sounds believable, if the explanation is structured well, if the details are convincing enough, then the lie will hold. But deception has very little to do with words alone, because words are only one layer of communication. Beneath them, something else is always happening. Your body is responding. Your tone is adjusting. Your timing is shifting. Your emotional state is either aligning or conflicting. And that conflict is where deception becomes fragile, because the moment your internal reality does not match your external expression, you are no longer communicating one message. You are communicating two, one spoken, one leaked. And the leaked message is often the more honest one. Empaths are particularly sensitive to this split. They don't just process language logically, they process presence emotionally. So when you say something that doesn't fully match how you feel, they register that difference. Not always consciously, not always immediately, but somewhere internally, something flags. This doesn't fully align. And alignment is everything, because truth has a certain simplicity to it. It doesn't require effort to maintain. It doesn't require constant adjustment. It doesn't create internal resistance. Lies do. They require monitoring. They require control. They require consistency across something that is inherently inconsistent. And over time, that effort begins to show. Your delivery becomes slightly too careful. Your explanation becomes slightly too detailed. Your reaction becomes slightly too managed. And that slightly is enough, because empaths are not looking for obvious proof. They are sensing subtle disruption. And subtle disruption is where deception quietly exposes itself. Empaths don't notice more because they're trying harder. They notice more because they've been trained, often by life itself, to pay attention. Many of them have spent years in environments where emotional signals mattered, where what was said didn't always match what was true, where reading the room was necessary, where sensing shifts in mood wasn't optional, it was survival. And over time, this develops into a kind of natural awareness, not forced, not performative, automatic. They begin to recognize patterns most people overlook: the pause before an answer, The change in breathing, the slight tightening in the voice, the moment confidence turns into defensiveness. These are not dramatic signals. They're subtle. But subtle doesn't mean insignificant, because patterns are built from small details repeated over time. And empaths are constantly collecting those details, not in a calculated way, but in a way that feels almost instinctive. They don't always analyze in the moment, but they remember. And memory creates comparison. Comparison creates pattern recognition, and pattern recognition creates insight. This is why someone can appear consistent on the surface, yet still feel inconsistent to an empath, because the empath is not only observing isolated moments, they are observing continuity. They are asking, often unconsciously, does this match who you've been over time? Does this align with how you usually show up? Is there a shift here that doesn't make sense? And when the answer is no, they don't always react immediately, but they don't ignore it either. They store it. And once enough of those small inconsistencies accumulate, what once felt like a vague feeling becomes something much clearer, a pattern. And patterns are very hard to hide from someone who is always paying attention. One of the biggest misconceptions about empaths is that they instantly trust their perception. They don't. In fact, many empaths do the exact opposite. They question themselves first. When something feels off, their immediate reaction is rarely accusation. It's introspection. Am I overthinking this? Did I read that wrong? Maybe I'm being too sensitive. This internal dialogue is not weakness, it's restraint. It's the empath giving reality a chance to clarify itself before reacting. But this restraint has a cost, because while they are questioning themselves, they are also delaying action. And this is where deception often survives longer than it should. Not because the empath doesn't sense the inconsistency, but because they try to disprove their own perception. They search for alternative explanations. They rationalize behavior. They extend understanding beyond what is reasonable. And sometimes they do this repeatedly because they don't want to misjudge someone. They don't want to create conflict unnecessarily. They don't want to believe something is wrong if it can be right. But truth doesn't disappear just because it's questioned. That initial signal, the one that felt off, doesn't go away. It lingers. And every new inconsistency adds weight to it, until eventually the empath is no longer dealing with a feeling. They are dealing with evidence. And at that point, the internal doubt begins to shift. They stop asking, what if I'm wrong? And start asking, why does this keep repeating? And that question is the beginning of clarity. Truth rarely reveals itself in one dramatic moment. It reveals itself through repetition, through small inconsistencies that on their own seem insignificant, but together form something undeniable. At first, it's easy to dismiss a strange reaction here, a slight contradiction there, a moment that doesn't fully make sense. Each instance feels too small to confront, too uncertain to define. But patterns don't rely on single moments. They rely on accumulation. And empaths are constantly, quietly tracking that accumulation. Not intentionally keeping score, but naturally noticing when something doesn't align over time. And alignment is what creates trust. So when alignment begins to break, trust begins to weaken, even before the empath consciously acknowledges it. Because the mind can rationalize isolated events, but it struggles to ignore consistent repetition. Eventually, the same type of inconsistency appears too many times, the same emotional shift, the same defensive tone, the same over-explained story. And now it's no longer random. Now it's recognizable. And recognition changes everything, because once a pattern is seen, it cannot be unseen. At that point, the empath is no longer interpreting behavior generously. They are interpreting it accurately. And accuracy removes illusion. This is where many lies begin to collapse, not because they were exposed directly, but because they became predictable. And predictability is the enemy of deception, because when someone can anticipate your inconsistency, your control over the narrative starts to disappear. There is a subtle but powerful shift that happens inside an empath. At first, they feel, they try to understand, they try to connect, they try to make sense of what doesn't feel right. But once patterns become clear, they stop feeling first and start observing. This shift is quiet, almost invisible from the outside, but internally it changes everything, because feeling seeks resolution, observation seeks truth, and truth doesn't require emotional negotiation. It requires clarity. So instead of asking, how do I fix this? The empath begins asking, what is actually happening here? They step back, they detach slightly, not because they don't care, but because caring without clarity creates confusion. And confusion is no longer acceptable. Now they're watching behavior more than words. They're noticing consistency more than intention. They're evaluating actions rather than explanations. And this makes deception much harder to sustain, because explanations can be adjusted, but behavior over time reveals itself. This is where many people feel a shift in the empath's energy. They may not understand it, but something feels different, less reactive, less emotionally available, less easily reassured. And that's because the empath is no longer trying to believe you. They're trying to understand the pattern. And once someone moves into observation, they stop being influenced by temporary performances, because observation is patient. It doesn't rush. It doesn't need immediate answers. It simply waits until reality becomes obvious. Silence, in the context of an empath, is often misunderstood. Most people interpret silence as confusion, as withdrawal, as emotional shutdown. But that's not always what it is. Sometimes silence is clarity. It's the moment the empath stops trying to resolve something that no longer makes sense. Before silence, there is usually effort. Effort to communicate, effort to understand, effort to repair. But when those efforts repeatedly meet inconsistency, something shifts. The empath realizes that more words won't create more truth. And that realization changes their behavior. They stop asking. They stop explaining. They stop chasing clarity from someone who is creating confusion. And instead, they become still. This stillness is not passive. It's decisive, because silence removes engagement. And without engagement, unhealthy dynamics lose their momentum. There's no argument to fuel, no emotion to manipulate, no reaction to control. And that can feel unsettling to the person on the other side, because they were expecting participation. They were expecting response. They were expecting the empath to continue trying, but the empath has shifted. They are no longer negotiating with inconsistency. They are acknowledging it. And acknowledgement doesn't require noise. It requires acceptance. And acceptance often looks like silence, not because nothing is happening, but because everything has already been understood. Trust for most people is a social agreement. For an empath, it's something far more structural. It's not just, I believe you. It's, I am building emotional reality with you. And that difference matters, because when an empath trusts someone, they don't do it casually. They open gradually. They observe consistency. They allow emotional safety to form over time. So when that trust is broken, the damage is not limited to the lie itself. It affects the entire structure that was built around it. Because trust is what allows vulnerability to exist. It's what makes honesty feel safe. It's what allows someone to show up without defense. And when deception enters that space, and it doesn't just introduce doubt, it introduces instability. Now, the empath is no longer standing on something solid. They're standing on something uncertain. And uncertainty changes how they engage. They become more cautious, more selective, more aware of risk. not because they want to withdraw, but because their system has registered something important. This is no longer safe in the same way. And safety, once disrupted, is difficult to restore because trust is not rebuilt through explanation. It's rebuilt through consistency, through alignment repeated over time. And until that alignment is reestablished, the empath cannot return to the same level of openness because for them, trust is not just emotional, it's foundational. One of the most underestimated consequences of lying is this: it doesn't just affect the present, it alters the past. Because when deception is discovered, it forces reinterpretation. Moments that once felt genuine now feel questionable. Conversations that once felt honest now feel uncertain. And the empath begins revisiting everything, not obsessively, but instinctively. Was that real? Did they mean that? Was I responding to truth or to something constructed? And this creates a unique kind of psychological tension because the past, which once felt stable, now feels unstable. And when the past becomes unstable, the mind struggles to find grounding. This is why betrayal often feels so intense, not because of one event, but because it multiplies across memory. It spreads. It reaches backward into moments that were once trusted and changes how they are perceived. For an empath, this is especially difficult because they don't connect through surface level interaction. They connect through meaning, through emotional depth, through perceived authenticity. So when authenticity is questioned, everything connected to it becomes uncertain. And uncertainty disrupts emotional continuity, which is why the impact of a lie often feels larger than the lie itself, because it's not just about what happened, it's about what everything meant. And when meaning becomes unclear, the relationship itself begins to lose its foundation. There is a point that many people don't notice until it's too late, the moment the empath stops investing. Externally, everything may still look normal. They may still respond, still communicate, still behave with calm. But internally, something has changed. They are no longer trying to build. They are no longer trying to repair. They are no longer trying to believe because belief requires evidence. And repeated inconsistency removes that evidence. So instead of pushing forward emotionally, they begin pulling back. Quietly, gradually, they share less, they expect less, they rely less. And this shift is not dramatic, it's subtle, but it's significant because relationships don't survive on presence alone. They survive on emotional investment. And when investment decreases, connection weakens, even if interaction continues. This is why many people are surprised when an empath eventually leaves, because they were still physically present, still engaged on the surface, but internally they had already begun detaching. And detachment doesn't happen suddenly. It happens in layers. Each disappointment removing a little more energy, each inconsistency reducing a little more trust, until eventually there is nothing left to invest. And at that point, leaving is not emotional. It's inevitable. Silence is often interpreted as a lack of strength, but in reality, it can be the clearest expression of it, because not all silence is avoidance. Some silence is decision. For an empath, silence becomes powerful when it is no longer driven by confusion, but by clarity. Before this stage, they may have tried to communicate repeatedly, tried to explain their concerns, tried to create understanding. But when those efforts meet resistance or inconsistency, they begin to recognize something important. More words will not create more truth. And once that realization sets in, they stop speaking in the same way, not to punish, not to manipulate, but to stop participating in something that no longer aligns. And that withdrawal changes the dynamic completely, because many unhealthy interactions rely on engagement, on reaction, on emotional exchange. Silence removes that. It removes access. It removes influence. It removes the ability to continue the same pattern. And that can feel unsettling to the other person because they were expecting continuation. But the empath has shifted. They are no longer trying to fix. They are no longer trying to be understood. They are simply choosing not to engage with what is already clear. And that choice is where silence becomes power. The biggest mistake people make is not the lie itself. It's the assumption that follows it. The belief that the empath will stay anyway, that understanding equals permanence, that forgiveness equals unlimited chances, that patience equals tolerance without limits. But this is a misunderstanding of empathy. Empathy is not the absence of boundaries. It is awareness. And awareness evolves. At first, it may express itself as compassion, as understanding, as giving space. But over time, awareness begins to recognize patterns. And once patterns are recognized, boundaries begin to form because awareness does not ignore reality. It adapts to it. So when someone continues to lie, they are not just repeating behavior. They are reinforcing a pattern. And patterns shape perception. Eventually, the empath no longer sees isolated incidents. They see consistency, and consistency defines character. This is where the shift happens. The empath stops asking, "Why did this happen?" and starts recognizing, "This is who they are showing me they are." And once that recognition is clear, their behavior changes accordingly, not out of anger, but out of alignment with reality. And reality, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen. Empaths don't leave quickly. They stay longer than most people expect, not because they don't see problem, but because they believe in resolution. They try to understand. They try to repair. They try to restore what feels broken. And this effort can continue for a long time because they don't give up easily on connection. But staying has a limit, and that limit is reached when understanding no longer changes anything, when communication no longer improves anything, when honesty is no longer consistent. At that point, staying becomes self-conflict, and empaths are deeply affected by internal conflict because they value alignment, not just externally, but internally. So when staying requires them to ignore what they clearly see, they face a decision: continue the relationship or remain aligned with truth. And eventually, truth wins, not aggressively, not dramatically, but decisively. And when they leave, it often feels sudden to the other person, but it wasn't sudden. It was cumulative, built over time. Every inconsistency, every broken moment, every unresolved pattern, all leading to one conclusion: this can't continue as it is. And once that conclusion is reached, leaving is no longer a reaction, it's a resolution. At the core of all of this is a simple but often ignored truth. Lies don't just hide reality, they reveal character. Because every act of deception communicates something deeper than the words themselves. It shows priorities, control over honesty, image over authenticity, avoidance over accountability. And empaths are not just listening for what happened, they are interpreting what it means. That's why lying to an empath is so risky, not because they will immediately confront you, but because they will understand you. And understanding changes everything, because once someone understands your patterns, they no longer rely on your explanations. They rely on what you consistently show. And consistency is difficult to fake over time, which means eventually truth surfaces, not through confrontation, but through recognition. And once recognition is complete, something irreversible happens. Perception shifts. And when perception shifts, so does connection. because connection depends on trust and trust depends on truth. Without truth, everything else becomes unstable. So the real danger of lying to an empath is not being exposed. It's being fully seen and no longer trusted. And once trust is gone, what remains may look like a relationship, but it will never feel like one again.